African Ascent, an internationally acclaimed television program, not as a consequence of my gifts, because my gifts are quite limited, but simply as a gift of the transcendent, has been interviewing luminaries and ordinary individuals with great success and with great fun for the past 15 years. But this time, African Ascent will be doing something very special, which makes me quite nervous and anxious because I'll be interviewing my oldest daughter, who is Ethiopian Chinese or Chinese Ethiopian, fluent in Mandarin, Taiwanese, but not Ethiopian, a consequence of my failure as a father for not having the time to have taught her that classical Ethiopian language. Solonia Teodros, a scholar in her own right, a graduate of the famous Boston University in international relations a few years ago. And since then, she and her colleague, her name briefly escapes me, shame on me, found an incredible school called Change School that specializes in articulating visions and aspirations of human beings who happen to be products of two or more nations or nationalities. In the case of Solonia, she's quite lucky to be the product of two effective global civilizations, namely the great Ethiopia and the great China. What an honor for African Ascent, and particularly for me, to interact with my own daughter, who's gone much further than me, although considerably younger, who has, among other things, given all kinds of speeches and talks, including a TED Talk on the global citizen, or the global self, as I call it philosophically. The two are interchangeable. So I thought what I'm going to do, which is always done, as you know, in a jazz style, at African Ascent, we do not rehearse questions. Questions emerge as a consequence of interactions with our guests. I take great pride for developing that style of interviewing for the past 15 years or so. In fact, I yet have to celebrate African Ascent for finishing its 15th year. And now it is viewed by thousands and thousands of individuals. And for the past 3 years, I've been quite lucky as a resident of Melrose to befriend a brilliant studio manager, Patrick Doyle, and also Michael, his assistant, who is also a professor at Harvard University, who have been helping me to bring African Ascent to the next level. And so what I thought I would do in this interview is compartmentalize my task into two. I'll begin with a question in which I'll be bonding with my own sister, with my own daughter. I don't get a chance to see her very often. In fact, I haven't seen her now for 5 years or so. And as you can imagine, I miss her dearly. My daughter is now pregnant, 2 months pregnant, I think, and I'll be a grandfather for the first time in my life. So the first part of the interview is going to be on a bonding between father and daughter. Welcome to African Ascent, Solonia.
Thanks, Dad. I'm excited to be here.
You couldn't be as excited as me. So why don't we begin by reflecting on your childhood in Cambridge and Somerville? Remember, there was a joke between you and me which we cannot repeat. I used to take you to Harvard Square, and at the time I was writing my first book on Antonio Gramsci. I'll take you to Widener Library, then I'll code you in 2 chairs, and then I'll make you take a nap there for 2, 3, 4 hours. You were just very peaceful child. And then we'll take long walks in the square. And I used to challenge you so that you can hone your analytic gifts by asking a question and encouraging you to respond to it in at least 10 different ways so that you can learn the difficult art of thinking, which is analytic thinking. It's like splitting hair. And you
Exactly.
All right, so let's talk about what do you remember?
Oh, gosh. So certainly remember the Harvard Square days. Started out with coffees in Aubampan,
Yes,
followed by the afternoons at Widener,
yes.
and emergency bio breaks on the fly as needed. um, and then, as you said, long walks home, where, yeah, indeed, you gave me a lot to think about, to analyze, always testing me. And then I think when we'd go home, I'd then have to read a couple Tolstoy chapters. And you'd ask me to reflect in my room for 2 hours and come out over dinner to give another analysis.
You remember all that,
I do.
Solonia.
Yeah.
And you're a very nice girl. You're still very nice, respectful, obedient, Chinese style. And like your mother, very well organized. And I think this has helped you considerably to have come as far as you have come. And what else do you remember about your childhood? Any pains, agonies, and particularly as a multiracial kid, maybe, or were you not thinking in those terms at all?
Well, I think that the time that I was in the US, and which was really the majority of the time you and I had together, was up until the age of 9. And I know a lot of early education sort of pedagogists and theorists would say those are formative years. And I think in some ways they are formative years. But I mean, my memories of that were largely very positive. I think I grew up as a pretty happy child. Music was obviously a big part of my life at that time, right? And in addition to our days walking and at the university, we also spent a lot of time exercising. You were insistent on me swimming as many laps as I could. I think once you actually threw me in the water, frustrated because I didn't know how to swim. And I think a lifeguard had to come get me. And I told on you to mom. And you weren't too pleased about that. So but overall, I have fond memories. In school, from what I remember, I had quite a diverse education experience in those early years because I went to Buckingham, Brown and Nichols, which was that almost like a finishing school in some ways, British system. But then moved into the public school system when you and mom split, and I was living in Brookline. So I think that also gave me very different exposure and experiences in the US. And to be honest, some of those memories are quite hazy, but I think overall still quite positive. For me, though, what I would probably define as the formative years were the years after that, right? So, 10 years old onwards, moving to Asia, being immersed in a totally different cultural context, going through your early to mid teenage years, all in Asia, right? So the next 10 years were sort of in Asia. And that's where I think a lot of different types of memories come. And perhaps it was only when I got to college, which was back in the States, where I experienced unexpected reverse culture shock, and really started to form, I think, my adult personality or young adult personality. And in the years since then, I think that's when I really have, since then, constantly been looking back and trying to connect the dots from my childhood all the way till present day. So I think a lot of the connections and the memories are still coming today. And it's still processing and still sense making and still contributing to how I make sense of the world, of my own experiences, of my own values. and it's constantly evolving, which I think is really at the heart of what the Change School was all about, was recognizing and celebrating that, we as people change and evolve with time, and as we go through different life phases, as we discover different things about ourselves, about the world, as we create new meaning to those experiences. So it's like this journey that I feel like I'm a constant detective trying to connect different pieces and different events to make, to form and refine a narrative over and over and over again.
Amazing. How keenly do you remember my Saturday calls to you when you first went to Taipei? I used to call you every Saturday. At the time, you were staying with one of your aunties, who was married to a Chinese by the name of Happy.
Uncle Happy.
Yeah, that's right. I used to call you every Saturday. Do you remember that? I was worried about you.
You were.
Loved you a lot. And then you left. And then it took me a very long time to admit that you'll somehow manage to carve out a life for yourself. I remember those Saturday anxieties, and I never failed to call you on Saturday. And I would want to know how happy you are. I remember my question, which must have been very boring and elusive, was, "Are you happy?" I remember that. And you must have said to yourself, "What is wrong with that?" But you're quite nice to me. You tell me, "Yes, I'm happy." What else are you going to say? Do you remember that, Solonia?
I do remember. And I mean, again, now looking back, I think, I don't know I can't recall what I was thinking at the time, but certainly if I look back now and I make sense of it, I think I was always pretty astute when I was young. And I think what I probably understood from that constant line of question.
Boring. The same question.
Well, I mean, if I'm honest, I think it came from such a genuine and well-intentioned place, but a lot of fear, right? I don't know if you were ready to hear the truth.
Yeah.
And so that was my answer. Yes, I'm happy. So you can sleep at night. And even if I weren't,
you're not going to say it.
Where would I even begin, and how would that make you feel? And that's one of those things I realized in my later years, as someone who's quite a high empath, in some ways to my benefit, in some ways to my detriment, because caring more for how is the other person going to feel or perceive what I say would often influence what I say. And so I think in your case, it was, good news or no news is better than the truth.
And you figured me out. You must have said to yourself, "I know how to handle this fool who is asking me a foolish question." Here I have become transported because of divorce to a new place where, among other things, I have to adjust. How is it possible for him to begin to think that I'm happy? But we never fought. We made the best that we could of those days, I remember. And I always looked forward to that. And then let me take you to Singapore. Singapore is also another challenge.
Another challenge.
Solonia, I was invited by your mother to come to Singapore because you were misbehaving. To contain you. So I was invited to come to Singapore to discipline you. And of course, I came. And I remember how gorgeous the apartment was. And I remember it was on one of the high buildings in a beautiful part of Singapore.
Mm-hmm.
My mother at the time was working for the diplomatic circle.
For the diplomatic, yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
she had a
Yeah.
high position place, a beautiful place that they gave her. I remember your blue room, and I remember our swimming together in the morning.
Yes.
And then I remember the afternoon rain, Singapore. I fell in love with Singapore.
In the balmy tropics, yeah.
Oh my God. Every day at exactly the same time, it rained. And I would sit there from the living room was gorgeous. I would sit there and look down because I love rain. And then what I learned is that you were not misbehaving at all. You were just growing. But your mother was a little bit nervous. So let's talk about Singapore a little bit. In what way was it like Taipei? And in what way was it different? And of course, these are two different periods of your life.
Yeah, exactly. I think it'd be easier, at least in the outset, to talk about how they were different, because I think it was such a relief for me at that stage of growth and growing up. So leaving Taiwan, which was at that time still a very homogenous place, one that was not accustomed to seeing outsiders, and certainly not dark-skinned outsiders, and certainly not Ethiopian Chinese little girls with with highly social personalities, bold enough to speak Taiwanese and Mandarin to anybody, not really understanding why everyone was completely confused by the words coming out of my mouth. So, after many years of dealing with that reaction and response and dynamic, when I got to Singapore, which was even then very much defined by its multicultural society, very colorful, both in terms of environment and people. And I didn't stick out. Until I got to tell my story and share what my different backgrounds were, and then slowly peel the layers and make deeper connections because I could speak at least two of the national languages. But just on the surface and in day-to-day interaction, there wasn't a huge surprise by me. And the school I went to, once again, international, but again, a school that was very much defined by very diverse student body. I was amazed by the backgrounds of my peers, Argentinian, Singaporean, Indonesian, Australian. They had all kinds of mixes. And so suddenly I felt like for the first time in my life, I'd found my place, a place where I could feel like I belonged, or at least I wasn't so different. And where difference was celebrated. So I think right off the bat, in that respect, Singapore was immediately starkly different. And so even the adjustment period for me, even being a teenager, was a lot smoother, easier, more natural. I made friends quickly. And at that time, Mom was still in the diplomatic corps, so she was constantly traveling. But I felt really comfortable in my new life there. What Singapore and Taiwan shared in common, of course, is the backdrop of still being in Asia, still holding a lot of traditional Asian values at its core. And I think for Mom, actually, if I look at things from her perspective, it was probably a bit harder for her as a parent to find a balance between retaining those traditional Chinese values and dealing with her teenage daughter, who's now in an international school that brings international values, European culture, something more foreign and more different, because Mom in Taiwan was at least in her home, in a familiar context, with her support system being her family. Whereas in Singapore, I think, everything was new and foreign for her just as much as it was for me. And so I think, to your point, she was very scared and nervous and unsure of how to deal with me. And the liberal sort of influences that come with being in a European contextualized educational environment. So little things like the British accent. So my school was, the teachers were primarily British, and that accent would rub off on me. I think that's one of the traits of a global self or a global citizen, is that you easily adapt to the point that even your accent can evolve depending on who you're speaking to. So I quickly lost my American accent, developed a British accent, and when I'd come home to mom getting a bit lippy in my British English, it made her very nervous, and I mean, just very uncomfortable and frustrated. And answering back, as you know, it's like the Asian no, right? I mean, it was a lot for her. And then I think, she probably had a lot of guilt too, of just having to travel 90% of the time and leave me at home. And while I was well taken care of, she was very much absent for a large part of that. And so, like you said, I don't think I was misbehaving. I was just naughty. I liked to party. I liked to be out, and Singapore creates a very safe environment to do so. Had I been like that perhaps in the US, I don't know how that would have turned out. But in Singapore, it's so safe that I think if there's any place for a teenager to go amok, that is probably the place to do it. But again, poor mom, just it was hard for her, I think. And the fact that she called you speaks to how hard it was.
She called me. She said, "Yeah, to see your daughter." I said, and it didn't take me very long because I missed you so much. I did come, but then on my second day, I noticed that you were the old Solonia, very courteous, very quiet, but you're in the process of growing and changing, which I thought is how it should be. Remember, as you put it, there is a tension between the calmness and quiet of the Asian personality and these multiple personalities that you're developing. Being a Chinese woman, a mother, very nervous. She also has to introduce you to the Chinese family. Remember, whenever I called, how little did I know as an Ethiopian what I was marrying. Every member of the family is on the phone. I did not realize this. I said, "What is this?" So I'll be talking to 10 people. And
you marry the family.
Yeah, tremendous affection and love. They want to know everything. I remember when you were born, your grandmother insisted that you should have your own laundry machine and dryer, and in that we are not allowed to mix your clothes with ours and so on. And I remember your grandmother also, and the agenda setter would wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning to develop a list of what to do for the rest of the day, which was also a trait of your mother. So I too had a lot of adjustment to make. And of course, I did not succeed. If I had succeeded, we could have remained married, but I did not pass the Chinese test. Now, by way of making a room for the second part of the interview, which is to think through the lineaments of what it means to be a global citizen, let's linger a bit and talk about how conspicuous is race in Asian culture. You might want to be very analytic here and separate the conspicuousness of race in Taipei from the elusive nature of race, I think, from what I'm learning from you in Singapore. Mm-hmm. Because unlike Taipei, in Singapore, I remember though, The Malaysians were invariably dark-skinned, were
Mm-hmm.
street cleaners, I remember, and the lawyers were Indians. And because I used to do some empirical research out of curiosity, and the Chinese were the entrepreneurs. That is when I began noticing that maybe in Singapore also, race is, after all, conspicuous, hidden, but always there.
Mm-hmm.
You might want to break that down for me.
Yeah, absolutely.
Don't mind.
So, no, of course, and I'm glad we look at these two countries as opposed to Asia as a whole, right? Because there's so much nuance from country to country. Um, so in Taiwan, so as I said, I think the period I was there, Taiwan was still very much homogenous, and I think in some ways Taiwan was going through a bit of an identity crisis as a country. Um, Primarily because of the relationship it's had and continues to have and evolve with China mainland, right? So currently today it's two nations, one straight, I think is the correct terminology. And depending who you speak to, we are either Chinese or we are Taiwanese, right? Depending on those who are pro-unification and those who are pro-independence. And so I think the conversation in Taiwan when it comes to race is less about race per se, but more around history, cultural identity. And, there's a lot of pride in what it means to be Taiwanese. And again, depending who you're speaking to, there may be a lot of pride that comes with the shared history with China. So, and then there's also there's this overlay of the history with Japan. So there are certain communities in Taiwan that actually identify more with being Japanese and having that history and all the cultural associations of being Japanese, and they very much resonate with that and almost want to be a part of that. There's been speak of changing the history books around what our relationship as a country, Taiwan, has been with Japan. And when it comes to, I guess, the foreigner in Taiwan, I think that's evolved a lot over the years, and certainly since the time I was there. When I was there, growing up was really hard, as I said, because they hadn't seen a lot of foreigners, and it was not uncommon for someone to come up to me, and I'll have to give a direct translation from Chinese here and just be like, hello, Black person. And it's easy to laugh now. When you're 12 years old, there's just nothing more mortifying or offensive than to be said that. And it's just ludicrous. But now that I'm much older and I can look back, and even I wouldn't be surprised if somewhere outside of the major city in Taiwan I would still have that experience today, because there's no bad intention, there's no even self-idea or awareness of what this means in terms of a bigger global conversation around race. It's just cluelessness. It's not, and I wouldn't even call it ignorance, I call it innocence, right? Because there's just not that concept of what's racially okay to say and not. And there's also, language, and that also influences how we communicate, right? In Chinese, to say Black man or Black woman or Black person is not nearly as offensive or rude as it comes across in other languages, or English, for example. I think it was just 5 years ago that I was out at a public swimming pool and someone came up to me and didn't really speak a word of English and just said, Obama. I didn't know how to react, if he thought I was related to Obama or if he was just signaling respect for Obama. But these kind of interactions happen, and today you can only laugh and appreciate the attempt to make a connection. That's what it really is, right? So I think, because of the period in my life when I was in Taiwan, it's difficult for me to speak very intelligently about race in Taiwan, but I can speak to how I perceived their understanding about identity more so, right? And I can say that certainly, race as a concept, even in my mind, has really come out more in the context of the US and some current affairs and how we think about these things, but it doesn't exist in the same way in Taiwan. You don't have those types of conversations like that. Let's switch to Singapore for a minute, and it'll be easier to kind of compare and contrast. So everything you said about race is definitely hidden. It's a hidden conversation. It's a hidden concept in Singapore, and I think you have to be very delicate when thinking about it, and certainly when talking about it. There's a lot of history, political, social, and cultural with Singapore, where race has been intentionally treated with delicacy, right? So Lee Kuan Yew, who's been the longtime grandfather, creator, mentor of the country, intentionally designed, he's known to have designed Singapore society very thoughtfully, and how to breed this culturally rich and diverse society was very much part of his agenda, down to even the way government housing was planned out. We call them HDBs, these government houses, and he'd even had it so that the Indian family the Indian families are carefully planned in one area, the Malay families are carefully planned in another area, the Chinese, etc. Singapore as a country has 4 national languages, all official languages. And these 4 official languages are taught in school in the local education system. So all students learn English, all students learn Mandarin, all students learn Malay. And I believe, I want to say, Tamil or Hindu, Tamil or Hindu. So 4 official languages. So they're automatically grown up and raised to have an appreciation for diversity at a certain level. But the reality of the world is that there is always going to be bias. There is always going to be stereotype. There's always going to be friction between different cultures. For me, it's hard to even use the word race in narrative, to be honest. It's so bizarre. It just doesn't come naturally to me. Cultures is what comes naturally to me. But and so if we talk a little bit about stereotypes, and I believe that stereotypes always have some truth to them, that's why they exist, right? You are right. So a lot of the business people, entrepreneurs, wealthier class, and arguably original Singaporeans are of Chinese or Chinese Malay origin, right? Because there's also an overlap with Chinese and Malaysian heritage. So, and historically, Singapore and Malaysia were one country. Then they split, then they reunified. Now they're split again as 2 individual countries. So there's the Chinese-Malay sort of root at its core. Then you have yes, and this is just generalizing, right? The workers that you spoke of, that you probably remember from your trip, are usually South Indian. And this is really interesting too. The Indian communities in Singapore, I mean, you could have a whole study on that alone, because India culture already has its own hierarchy, right? It has its own caste system, and that's been brought over into Singapore as well. So you have your North Indians who tend to be part of that upper class echelon, and within that, the caste system, that's very much Indian. And they tend to be the lighter skinned. And then you've got the South Indians, so be it from Sri Lanka, from Calcutta, from other parts of South India, the darker skinned folk. And they do tend to be working on the streets. And I think if you live in Singapore for many years, as I have, and certainly if you come from the more privileged expat community, you may be blind to this, or you may come to see very clearly that there's some real questionable behavior and treatment of this group of people. Some would say, is it modern day slavery? Some would question, right? Others would say that this is very, common in Asian societies and cultures to have your working class, et cetera, et cetera. Again, treating Singapore with the delicacy that it requires. I'll leave it to people to experience firsthand and make their own observations. But certainly we've seen in the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen this flare up. There's a part of Singapore called Little India where there was an incident where actually the South Indians, someone got run over on a truck, and it caused what I think was the first riot in Singapore of South Indians really and lashing out on a lot of long-term mistreatment. So there's certainly that dynamic. And then of course you have the expat community. Mm-hmm. And they have been growing and thriving, I'd say, over the past 10 to 20 years as Singapore has, notably advanced its economy in a way that no other Asian nation has seen, right, for such a small country. So, and I think that expat life is very much in its own bubble. And it kind of creates a whole new dynamic around European, Western culture vis-a-vis the local Chinese, Malay, Indians, North and South Indians. So it's there's a lot to be studied and observed and dug into deeper in Singapore, for sure. And it's difficult to make generalizations. I think I've been very fortunate having grown up in an international school, but also had deep connections with local friends and communities to have been able to see everything 360. And having had 20 years in Singapore, I also don't consider myself to be in the expat circles. So kind of sitting on the edge of the local, of the expat, of the international, has allowed me to see many facets of cultural dynamics in Singapore. And I think it's fascinating.
Incredible. And of course, I remember how impressed I was by the TED talk that he gave on the global citizen, which for me was drawing out from this rich tapestry that you just articulated so well, to develop possibilities for the human self, which could take the shape and form of democratically inclined globality, internationalism, and so on. I would like you, now that we have about 25 minutes to, in your own calm style, develop the idea of the global citizen as a manifesto of the change school. So you might want to divide the question that I've just asked you first to a discussion of the change school, and then to one of its prominent contributions, the articulation of the idea of the global citizen. So you might also want to introduce Grace, your partner, with this remarkable school.
Yeah. Gosh, I love going down this memory lane of how the Change School started and evolved and grew up. So Grace, my co-founder, my best friend, my childhood friend from school in Singapore, we came together, I think, in 2014 or 2013. And we had both just returned to Singapore after being in New York, for me for about 4 years, for Grace about 3 years. And we shared a lot of common ground, apart from having gone to school together. Both our parents, my mom, her dad came from the diplomatic world. So we were exposed to a lot of different cultures growing up and at home and in life. We both, I think, studied international relations, or she took marketing, generalist subjects, right? I mean, we would joke about it and say these are majors for kids who really have no clue what they want to do in life. And so we had both sort of tried all kinds of different jobs, bounced around from one industry to another, one city to another, found ourselves back in Singapore grappling the same questions. How do we discover who we are? How do we weave that into the work that we do? How do we find a sense of purpose? How do we feel a sense of belonging? We had so many questions and so many experiences that we were trying to make sense of. And we also quickly recognized that we weren't the only ones asking these questions and feeling these things and getting a bit overwhelmed and confused by it all. And so this culminated in the creation of the Change School, because we wanted to create a space and almost like a new value system, right? A new institution or way of thinking, being, and taking action in order to find and carve your own path of identity, of purpose, and way of life, right? Understanding that we are multifaceted human beings with so many different influences, with so many different ideas and ideals, and how do you reconcile it all? How do you bring it all together? And we also felt that today's education system just doesn't equip you for this. You know, for all the years of schooling and for the majors we had taken and the degrees that you're told you need to have to be successful in the world, why was it that, at least in our generation with our peers, why were we seeing so many lost souls? Why were so many people confused about these very questions? Who am I? What are my gifts? How do I bring them into the world? How do I bring value and make a difference? And how do I build a career? So that was really the early beginnings of the Change School. And the format in which we tried to share this knowledge and share inspiration and become a support system for others changed, evolved a lot, right? Initially, it was through immersive retreats where we would take people on adventures in places like Bali and Thailand to help them really pause and reflect, and what we would say, shut out the noise. So, you know, be able to tell your Asian mom or your Asian family or whatever societal pressures or opinions were surrounding you, to just give you the space to pause and reflect and find your own meaning and look back on where you came from and look back on your childhood experiences and make sense of that and create your own narrative on your own. And so those were the immersive retreats. And then as we discovered that a lot of people coming on those retreats were not just aspiring entrepreneurs, so people who are already sort of checked out of the corporate world and 9 to 5 and said, I want to do something on my own, but also young professionals, even mid-level professionals, kind of having this aha moment, like, okay, I became a doctor or I was an engineer because my parents told me to be this, or because I've done this for 10 years, I never knew any better. But this isn't what I want to do. So they were having this moment of self-discovery and realization, which is almost a crisis, right? And so that invited us to switch to test a new format. So for people who couldn't necessarily check out of their lives for 2 weeks at a time and go to a retreat, we came to them by delivering workshops in the nearby co-working space or inside their offices. So we started doing organizational training programs. and partnerships with other education institutes that would be open enough to this type of transformational learning. And it was challenging in an Asian context, right? Because the question we would always get is, are you certified in this? What credentials do you have? Will they come out with a certificate? Is this going to get them to Harvard? And these are the common questions we would face, and it was challenging, but really, it was the heart and soul of why we were doing what we were doing, and so that was really it was a beautiful journey of understanding people, of understanding ourselves, and really, I guess, to use more of your language, like on some level, the human condition, right? Not at a certain level, right? On a very individualized level, right? This idea of struggling to define who we are, right? And struggling to reconcile ideas of what's right and wrong, what should be, what could be, etc., right? And being courageous enough to define it for yourself without asking permission. Right. So fast forward to the opportunity to speak at TEDx Auckland in New Zealand. So while all this was happening, I think Grace and I probably took for granted the one thing we had in common, which was this sense of the global self. I mean, we took it for granted. We hadn't thought about it yet at the time that we were building the Change School. But it did come to us, I think, 1 or 2 years into building what started as a project and developed into this business. And it really helped, I think, to bring new shades and depths to what we were doing. It helped us to recognize that while everything we were talking about and doing and helping people to achieve was applicable to everyone, there were certain types of people that would resonate more easily with it. There were certain types of people who found themselves more lost. There were certain types of people who were, even if they were afraid, they were ready to take this big step and go on this journey. And oftentimes it was people who lived in the gray like we did, whether that was because they came from bicultural backgrounds, or they'd lived around the world, or they'd had these plethora of experiences that were almost so rich it was overwhelming to make sense of, or they had this aha moment that just led them to question everything. What we started to see was our upbringing and the context in which we grew up was a huge advantage and privilege, because we didn't have this black and white view of the world. Everything was a shade of gray, right? And that meant that our appetite for change was greater than a lot of people. I mean, most people say, right, humans don't like change. We're uncomfortable with change. For Grace and I think we thrive on change. We get bored if things aren't evolving. And it's almost looking for the opportunity to challenge the status quo and to think differently and to find similarities versus differences. And so I think as that became clear to us, we started Change School TV and a YouTube channel and started interviewing different people to really unpack what this idea of global citizen meant in the world. What, did they resonate with it? Did they not? There are some sort of, I think, educators and philosophers from the 90s who used to define global citizens as the children of, what are they called? Like military families, right? Had very defined, a very specific definition. And I think it just got dated. Since the 90s, there was no new definition, new study into this idea of global citizens. And it was really interesting. We must have interviewed about hundreds of people on our channel around this idea of global citizens. And we did not really know to expect what we got. Some people thought it was a bit of a high horse mindset. So we had people coming to us saying, well, what if I didn't live in 5 different countries? What if I don't speak 3 languages? What if I don't have the privilege of traveling like you do? Does that mean I'm not a global citizen? And others felt that, well, if you're a global citizen, you should be involved in relief work and working for UNESCO or UNICEF and building homes for the underprivileged communities. That, again, such black and white thinking around who is a global citizen and who's not. Do I qualify or do I not? And it was so interesting to see, once again, human nature in action. And so that really inspired us to challenge the world and to share our view of redefining what it means to be a global citizen, not in terms of the number of languages you speak or the number of countries you've been to, but your mindset and a set of values that you ascribe to, right? That we are one human race, that we are here on this planet to do good for the world at large. And others, there's a lot of people who thought it was too idealistic. And instead, New Zealand called and said, we love this idea of global citizenship. And, this is very much on our radar and something we'd like you to come and speak to. And so when we went to Auckland, I was wonderfully surprised by, my theory is that because New Zealand sits at the end of the earth, they're actually so connected to the world. They were really plugged into current affairs and global affairs, and they listened to our talk and they embraced this idea of global citizenship far more than even a place like Singapore, for example. So yeah, we were happy to share that message, and I think at the end of the day, it was hopefully well received because it was simply an invitation to say, see the world as yours as much as it is for you sitting in New Zealand, as it is for the next person sitting in another country, and focus on the similarities of what we share as humans, and go out and be curious to discover the similarities you might share with other people of other cultures, rather than focusing on this black and white thinking and view of the world and understanding of different concepts.
Incredible. And of course, I remember how good of a writer you are. In fact, you talked about writing a book together. I think we should consider writing a book together on this idea of the global citizen.
It would help me actually start writing again.
I think we should do that. You should consider that. I know you're quite busy, you're expecting a child now, and you're in a new environment in Portugal. In fact, we might also want to enlist the services of your sister, who is a gifted writer.
She is a wonderful writer.
Who's also a global citizen like you, Lebanese, Ethiopian. I think we should consider writing a book among the 3 of us, which will be experiential and theoretical. I just finished publishing my 16th book called Self-Definition, in which I examine the idea of globality philosophically. But we can go beyond the theoretical claims that I make, and then draw from your experience, from your sister's experience, and carve out what he called this new path, new space, that human beings who are born at different places, at different times, to different cultures, can actually frame their identities, not through binaries,
right,
but through something else.
Yeah.
I propose the possibility of
I would love that.
Writing the book together.
And
So
actually, with my maternity leave coming up, I'll be off work for a few months. It would be the perfect white canvas to work with.
we talked about this, but you became very busy. Why don't you go back to it now and then send me an outline maybe, and also share it with your sister.
Yeah.
And then I'll come in as the third partner. I think we can write a brilliant book together. Now, African Ascent is your home, not because I run it, but because you're so smart and you have devoted your young life to it. You should come when you have time and share with the world your projects, your thoughts, your visions. So I invite you to consider coming back anytime.
Thank you. I would love that.
Mine, for the benefit of my viewers, they are now becoming thousands. You might want to reflect just a little bit about Portugal, which is where you live. Your sister told me you live in a beautiful area in Portugal. I can't wait until I come to see it. And in that you've carved out as a global citizen a beautiful space for yourself.
Yes, well, I have created a lovely new nook here in Lisbon. Admittedly, I'm coming up to, it will be 3 years in February, although I do still feel very new to this place. For a few reasons. I mean, one, obviously, we've been in a pandemic, so I feel like a year's been stolen from me. And two, because what is very new for me in general is to live in a place where I don't speak the native language. I'm learning Portuguese as best I can. Not an easy language for me, but it is a very new experience to not speak the native language, and there's suddenly this new distance or disconnection to the people that I've never had in my life of living in different places in the world. So, part of the draw to Portugal was, I think, after a total of 20 years in Asia, fast-paced, forward, future planning society, it was just such a breath of fresh air to come to a whole new part of the world where I felt that life was valued almost more than career and work and efficiency. It is just slower pace, and that comes with its own challenges, right? Yeah. But that was really the initial draw, and it has seasons. I mean, I miss the tropics, but I think there's something beautiful about seasons in reminding you of the passing of time. I think in Singapore, when you're by the equator, for example, where all year is just hot and hotter, it's easy to lose concept of time, right? There's no markers to say that here's winter's just passed and another 4 months have just passed. We're entering a new spring, etc. So I really appreciated that change of environment. And yeah, it's a beautiful place, and as I said, I'm still discovering and learning the culture.
And are you both now running with Grace the Change School, and you're also a CEO or a director?
So
you're an entrepreneur?
Well, actually, these days I identify more as an entrepreneur. So I have taken on a full-time role with an American IT asset company here in Portugal, and it's been wonderful here. I'm heading up their communications, culture, and enablement. So that allows me to bring in a lot of what we did at the Change School into a real corporate environment and really have to, from the inside out, see how change and transformation can happen within an organization. So both a challenge and a wonderful opportunity. Meanwhile, Change School, we were on a hiatus for a while. Grace has actually started a full-time role with Facebook. So she is inside Facebook, and we are sort of, the communities that we've built with the Change School are still there. open for career shifters, for global citizens. We do virtual coaching and we have all our online courses up, but we've been far less active, in the last 2 years, and hopefully we'll see how that sort of evolves and takes shape over the next few years. But we are still accessible and reachable.
Please
certainly.
don't abandon the change school. It's your brainchild. Races
Thanks.
and yours, the brainchild. Well, this has been considerably pleasurable for me, both as a producer
Me too.
of Ascent, but also as a father of a very smart person, namely Solonia Teodros. This has been your host, Teodros Kiros, for Ascent.